This meeting is being recorded.
We are on. So what I want to do is I wanted to share with you a seminal piece from Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, which actually is found on the last week's Parsha, but it very much applies to, the whole thing. The end of Parshas Bo, we have really the Exodus from Egypt. The 10th plague is over. We have the commandment for the Karban Pesach, the blood, the doorpost, and we got some tefillin in there. It tells you how long the Jews were there, but it says they actually left Egypt. But this piece is found on what's called a Khodosh Azelachem, that the first mitzvah that's given to Bnei Yisrael is the mitzvah of Kirisha Khodosh, of sanctifying the new moon, which we had touched upon last time. That the first thing that a free person has control over is his or her own time, something they did not have as slaves. So when you have your own input into determining the holidays and how they fall out, etc., that was the indication of that very first communal mitzvah that's given. So I'll put it on the screen, and then we can go through it. We'll kind of work through it. It's a really, really interesting piece, and it answers a lot of questions which you may or may not have thought about over the years, but really, really interesting. Okay, you see it? Okay, let me just try and get everybody that I could see over here. Let's see everybody. Okay, great. So it starts here, Khodosh Azelachem. So, Kasav Ramban. Let's see if I can make it a little bit larger. Hold on. There we go. Better? Better. Kasav Ramban. Vizel Lashono. Ukfar hiskiru Rabboseinu, Zeh ha'inyan, v'amru shemos chadashim alu yimanu b'Bavel. כי מתחילו לא היו לו שמות אצלנו וכולי, אבל כאשר עלינו מבבל, חזרנו לקרוא חדשים שנקראים בארץ בבל, להזכיר כי שם אמרנו משם לנו השם יתברך. Now, one of the things we notice is that the names of the Hebrew names of the months on the Jewish calendar are not necessarily Hebrew names. They're not Lashon HaKodesh. So, and he says that. Again, he's quoting from the Yerushalmi from the Jerusalem Talmud, which is actually going to be very important later on when he discusses the notion of the Jerusalem Talmud. And he says that these new months, the Shmos HaChadashim, not new names, but the names of the months, came with us from Babylonia. Of course, the Jews were exiled out of Israel. They're in a Babylonian exile for quite some time after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, Nebuchadnezzar, the whole bit. And he says when they came back from Bavel, they kept the names of these months to tell to make us remember, because that's where we came from and that's where Hashem brought us out from. Ki Eila Hashemos Nisan Iyar v'Zulasam Shemos Parsiim v'lo yimatzei rak b'sifrei Nevi'ei Bavel u'v'Megillas Esther v'chulei ad kan l'shono. The Yerushalmi says is that the names of the months like Iyar or Nisan are actually Persian in origin, not biblical necessarily, because by the way, you won't find in the Torah, it doesn't say B'chodesh Nisan. It always says the HaChodesh Azelachem Rosh Chodesh B'chodesh HaRishon. Nisan in the Torah is always referred to as the first month, doesn't actually give the names. Okay, so if you ever wonder, like, why do we have the names that we have? And that's why. V'hine yesh litmoa. Madua be'emes azvu lashon haTorah v'niket v'naktu lashon paras. Ubefrat b'shemos hachadashim sheish ben shemos avodah zarah kagon Tammuz. He says, so why would we adopt a sort of non-traditional or non-Jewish source for the names of our months? And he says, I'm not familiar with so much avodah zarah. I'm familiar with some avodah zarah, not modern day avodah zarah, but ancient avodah zarah. Apparently, the name Tammuz comes from a name of avodah zarah. He says, so why would they ever keep such a name? Normally we try to keep things very, very Hebrew. So for instance, when I'm sure everybody has this somewhere in their family that, let's say when they came from Europe, and if they had the zechus to go to the land of Israel, they changed their names, either first names or last names, to represent, like kind of these like strong, like, I don't know, Berkowitz became Barak, something like that. These strong, like Koach, Otzim Yadi, that type of name. But why would we want to keep a semblance of a non-Jewish name? And by the way, and names are a very, very funny thing when in Judaism in general. We've touched on this a little bit before. So, for instance, how the name Alexander becomes a Jewish name is based on the Gemara. It tells the story that they made a deal that they would name all the children after Alexander the Great instead of putting an idol up in the Beis Hamikdash and his likeness. They said, "I'll tell you what, we'll name all our kids Alexander." So the name Alexander, Alexandra, Sender, Sendi, all these types of things stem from that incident. But there's a reason behind it, and you wonder, like, how do you have Jewish kids with certain names? And by the way, depending on where we lived. People in different countries would take the names of the leaders as an homage or as a tribute, or as maybe even as thanks for giving them safe harbor, and they're not necessarily Jewish names. So the same thing happens with the months. So why is that the case? So that's what Rav Yaakov, he says, he asked the question. By the way, he has a similar approach to this in his introduction. It's on the first, I think in his commentary on Pirkei Avos, in the very first Mishnah, or in the introduction to the first Mishnah, a very similar piece. He says, Emes, matzinu shebiyamei ba'yesheni, haisa hasafa hameduberes b'Yisrael lashon arami. He says, in the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, the common language was Arami, which is Aramaic. And only Torah was written in what we call Lashon HaKodesh. It's not Hebrew, but it's Lashon HaKodesh, the biblical Hebrew. He says, wait a minute. One of the things that we say that why did the Jewish people merit salvation from Egypt? We say there were three things, or maybe four, according to some different versions of the Medrash. They didn't change their names, they didn't change their dress, and they didn't change their language. They spoke Hebrew or whatever, maybe it was Yiddish. I don't think they had Yiddish back then, but they spoke the Mama Lashon back then. Now, there are different ways of looking at this that Medrash. Now it's so great. Look at that. They kept their names. Oh wow, beautiful. They kept their I don't know what the Jewish mode of dress was, but they kept their language. Some say that at a certain point we couldn't tell the difference between Jews and non-Jews, except for the fact that they had their names and they had their clothing and they had their language. In other words, that's all they had left. So God had to take them out, because if he had waited any longer, there would be no distinguishable characteristic to differentiate between the Jewish population and the non-Jewish population. But if it's considered a praise that they didn't change their language, why are we adopting these foreign terms, these foreign phrases as the names of our months? Rosh Chodesh, we just had last week, Rosh Chodesh Shvat, Yiyeh B'Yom Sheni. Gewalt, it's a beautiful tefillah. He says, first we have to introduce what we have in the Gemara and Yoma. The Gemara there, which addresses much of what took place on Yom Kippur, but also a lot that took place in the Beis Hamikdash itself, he says that there was a difference between the first and second temple. And there were 5 things that were missing that in the second temple that did not take place, which existed in the first temple. V'harishan mehem hu ha'aron asher nignez b'mei Yoshio HaMelech. And of course, there was one of the most prominent things, of course, is the ark itself. The ark in the times of Yoshio HaMelech, King Yoshio, they hid the Aron, and of course, it's the subject of movies and books. There's actually a new book just came out in the last few months, kind of chronicling the amount of people that have tried to bury. I think it's called Underneath Jerusalem. It was actually just reviewed in a podcast in the Times of Israel. Really interesting. It was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal about 3 weeks ago, in the weekend edition in their book review. But one of those things chronicling all the people that have tried to dig under the city of Jerusalem. By the way, and it still continues at Hayom Hazeh. They haven't stopped. He says, he says it would seem ostensibly that the reason why the ark was missing was because it was hidden. He says, but that's not necessarily the case, because we have a Gemara in Shkolim, part of the Jerusalem Talmud, which is incorporated in part of the Daf Yomi for some reason. It's a different story for a different time. The Isa Hasam, and he tells the following story. It's a fantastic Gemara. There was one Kohen, and he's kind of like, I don't know, maybe he's like rooting around in the basement of the Beis HaMikdash area, and he sees like a tile out of place. Like when somebody has a safe hidden in the floor, or if you're hiding something and you see a rock out of place, you see a brick out of place. Oh, maybe there's a false wall. Maybe something's going on there. So the Kohen sees that in the floor that there's something, that one of the tiles or the pieces is different than the others. So Bava Amar Lachaveru lo hispik ligmar hadavar. So he went to go tell his friend, like, oh my God, check this out. So lo hispik ligmar hadavar. Mishnah says that before he could even tell his friend, something happened and he died on the spot. And they knew right away, oh, by the way, that's where the ark is hidden. Now, when you see a Mishnah like this, you're like, wait a minute. We know where it is. Why did they go after it? Why did they get it? So in other words, even though they knew that this is the place where the ark is hidden, nevertheless, they never made any effort to try and put it in its rightful spot, which is in the Holy of Holies in the Khodosh Kodashim. He says, no, they realized that in the second temple, there's a specific reason why the ark should remain hidden. Why even hidden, not meaning that we don't know its location, meaning it shouldn't be in its proper rightful place, which is in the Holy of Holies. It should stay underneath in this secret place for whatever reason. And he asked, Madua, why? Fascinating Gemara. So the whole, if Indiana Jones had only read this Gemara, he wouldn't have had to go all the way, to Egypt and this, that, although it made for a really good movie. We had once, I probably told you this story once. We had Josh Gindi had his bar mitzvah. He's a Kohen, and his bar mitzvah was Parshas Tetzaveh. And it's fitting because Tetzaveh deals with the laws of the Kohen Gadol and the vestments of the Kohen Gadol. So I remember it was right before yeshiva break, and I said to him, I'm giving you homework. I said, you have to watch this movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark. And in it, when Beshalach, the French archaeologist, the nemesis of Indiana Jones at that time, when he finds the ark and they go to that place to open it up, he actually puts on the Big Day Kahuna. And if you see carefully, he did a very good job. He starts saying, so he starts saying Brich Shmei Demari, and so I'm like, watch it, and you'll see the vestments, and we're learning about it. I'm like, look at it. So I come back after Yeshiva week. I'm like, how was it? He goes, because that movie sucked. It was terrible. The graphics were awful. I go, oh man, you guys are so spoiled with your 3D and all these CG, whatever the technology is. This is what we grew up on. This is the stuff. Okay, but they did a pretty good representation of Big Day Kahuna. If you ever see it, look at it closely. But for some reason, according to the Mishnah in Shkalim, it was meant to stay where it was and not in its rightful place. Why? So two questions. Why would they use the language of a foreign land, and why would the ark be hidden? So now he's going to come to this beautiful yesod. Nira, she'ole Bavel, shebanu as habayis hasheni. The people who came from Babylonia, those who built the second Beis HaMikdash, which, by the way, wasn't so to begin with. We talk about the story of Purim, which we've looked at. And when Ezra and Nehemiah got people to go back, not everybody went back. They only had like 42,000 people went, and it was the Nachschleppers, and they didn't know what to do. When they got there, they had to change all the halachas because they didn't know what Truma was, Meiser, who was a Kohen, who wasn't. The whole Gemara, Asura Yuchsin, and the end of Kedushin addresses exactly this issue because they had questions of lineage. But you would think that, when Mashiach comes or they're going to build a Beis HaMikdash, everybody would run. No, you know my bit about this. Anyway, so Nira She'ole Babel, those who built the second Beis HaMikdash, Yadu Kiloza Habinyan Asher Ya'amod La'olamim. When they built the second Beis HaMikdash, they knew that it would not be eternal. Ve'ein chazarasam la'eretz Yisrael b'tekufa zu ha'geula ha'shalema. Wow. And he says that when they returned to Eretz Yisrael after years of exile in Babylonia, they knew that this was not the complete redemption. Daitim haisa ki binyan habayis b'tekufa hazos lo noad ela lahachines am l'tekufa hagalas arucha. He says that the whole reason of building the Beis HaMikdash the second time around for this period was only lo noad. It was appointed. It was a sign to prepare them for the bigger, longer period of exile. It was like a precursor for an even longer exile. The Babylonian exile, we have the prophecy of the 70 years, etc. But when they came for this one, they knew it was only temporary. We had to do something because you think this Gullus was bad? You think this exile was bad? Oh, wait till you see what's coming. Al Pishur Sadin, according to the letter of the law, they really should have stayed in Babylonia longer. He says, however, they saw with a certain level of providence that after 70 years in the exile of Babylonia, 70 years in exile, already nitma v'nisarev, which means they were mixed together. There was so much intermarriage. Most of the people with the non-Jews, ubarer kashem ashaya, ki im yisakfu b'nei Yisrael b'galos meos v'alfei shanim, she'az b'vadai lo yatzliach am lishaher b'zehusa miuchedes v'shuv lo yiyeh es miligol. And they realized, I'm sorry for the crooked copy, but they realized that if they would stay longer, hundreds more years, let's say till they're really ready to be redeemed, what would happen? There would be nothing left of the Jewish people. There would be no semblance of their Jewish identity. He calls bezehuso of, again, you have your Tudat Zehut, it's your identity card if you're in Israel. Therefore Hashem had rachmanas on the Jewish people, on his nation. He took them out of Babylonia and he brought them back to Israel. But ofen zmani, only for a temporary period, la'eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel. Ubana lahem es beis havachira, v'hakol b'chadei she'ashuva v'yischazku b'yisodos hamuna v'yu mechusanim likras tekufas hagalus hamara. Really interesting language, particularly today. He says, and the whole thing was so that they should return and they should be yischazku, strengthen b'yisodos hamuna, with the foundations of faith. And mechusanim, today, what does mechusan mean? Right? It means vaccinated. Right? Today, Rav Yaakov was ahead of his time. Right? They had to be vaccinated. No, but in other words, they had to be prepared. Almost, what's the word I'm thinking of? Whatever, you know what I mean? But they had to be able to have enough, like it had to give you enough of a charge so that you would be able to last for the long period of Gullus. Now, by the way, so the question always is now, does 1948, does that end the Gullus or not? Which is, of course, a great theological question, a hashkafic question, a philosophical question, whatever you want to put it. Different people have many different feelings on that, but that's more of a Yom Ha'atzmaut shir. Anyway, b'chadei lahadgish u'lahamchish la'am she'adayin hem lo nigalu v'him be'etzem adayin hem Gullus. So, but how do you redeem people? Put them back in Israel, but let them know that it's temporary and make them feel like, yeah, this isn't really it. So he says, in order to do that, so the word ulahamchish la'am, like to make people really sense, to really understand that they're not fully redeemed and that be'etzem, and in essence, they really are still in exile. Lo helo es ha'aron, we didn't bring up the Aron Khodosh. Makar ha'kedusha b'bayis rishon, that is the source of all the sanctity of the first Beis HaMikdash. Of course, the holiest object and the holiest place is the Ark. So by not having that already, that's clue number one that, you know what, we're not there yet. This is not the end of everything. They left it where it was hidden because redemption was not complete. Which, by the way, so this is why what people say is that until we have, let's say, a Beis HaMikdash, or until we have the Ark in its rightful place, or until we have a religious entity ruling over the land of Israel, this is the position why people say that this is not the ultimate redemption. Okay, which is why there was a whole machlokas. It's a Rabbi J.J. Schachter, my Rebbe, he gives a beautiful, you could probably find it online somewhere, that when the creation of the state of Israel, when they made the prayer for the state, is Avinu Shebashamayim Tzur Yisrael V'Goalo, right? Barechas Midinas Yisrael Reishis Tzmichas Geulasenu. So there are a lot of people that, first of all, don't say the prayer. They don't want to say the prayer, or whatever it is, to each his own. But the language itself, which the authorship is most likely attributed to Rav Herzog, and by the way, so you know that yesterday, Bougie Herzog, his mother passed away. He's sitting shiva now. But Reishit Smichas, the beginning. So it's not Geulah Seinu. It's not the redemption, but it's Reishis, it's the beginning of the sprouting of Tzmichas Geulah. In other words, this is not it. It's something. It's definitely something. We can't ignore it, but it's not the whole thing. But a lot of it is based on this. In other words, they want to try to be sensitive to all of the notions out there. I mean, actually, it would be interesting. Maybe around Yom Ha'atzmaut, we could study that, the origins. It's a brilliant topic, the origins of that prayer. Rabbi Schachter told me he once had the ability to go into Rav Herzog's study and bury himself in there, and he found certain manuscripts which led to this. Anyway, Machmas Hakarasam Zu, Sha'adayin Lo Higia HaGeulah HaShalema, Hinhigu Ole Bavel Kama V'Kama Inyanim Sheyu Osim Kamo Shahayu Nogim B'Tkufas HaGalut. So therefore, since this is not the full redemption, it's a redemption, it's a partial redemption, but it's not the redemption. So therefore, those who came up from Babylonia, they still kept a number of things which they were accustomed to doing in Babylonia. Laharos shebe'emes tekufas golos Bavel adayin imsheches v'habinyan hanivna eno ela aroi va'asid lehicharev. To show that in actuality, that the exile of Babylonia was still going on. So imagine that, being in Israel and still being in exile. But really that this building that they're building, the second Beis HaMikdash, would not be permanent. It will only be temporary, and it would soon be destroyed. Machmazeh, Keshe'olu miBavel, Chazru likro Shemas HaChadosh M'Shem Shnik b'Bavel, Kmo shekosav Ramban, Lahazkir Kisham Amanu Misham Ha'elanu Hashem Yisborach. The reason why then they kept the names of the months, the Babylonian, really ultimately Persian names, as they morphed and Babylonia took over, but the Persian names, the non-Jewish, the non-biblical names, as they called them in Babylonia, they kept that in Eretz Yisrael because this is part of saying that we're still in exile. And again, as the Ramban wrote, to remember, to remind ourselves, because that's where we're from and that's where we're taken from. Kolomar, K'dei lizkor shebe'emes lo nigalu ba'ofen mushlam, to show and remember that they were not completely redeemed. V'lachem gam l'shonam nishar b'lashon hagolus l'shon Arami. That's why they spoke Aramaic. If this was a permanent redemption, if this was the Geulah Shlema, they would never speak another word of Aramaic again. Okay, it's nice, by the way. So when you go to Israel today, there's so much of traditional Judaism that creeps into the regular life. Although we had an interesting series of conference calls this week, the last couple of days. There's a lot of back and forth between the chief rabbi and some other rabbis about conversions, whatever. I don't want to get into the details, but one of them mentioned, and we were able to hear both sides of the story and then come up with nothing. But one of the stories that was mentioned is that there was a gan. And there was a big fight in one city, I don't know, for the Gan, because they told them, you can't say to the kids on Thursday, Shabbat Shalom. Because Shabbat Shalom already has a religious connotation. You have to say, which, by the way, in the secular, you hear it sometimes, we'll say, Sof Shavua Na'im. You'll often see in Israeli writing, in Hebrew writing, an acronym for Sof Shavua, Samach Vav Fei Shmuchak Shin, which means Sof Shavua. They say Sof Shavua Na'im. Okay, but when I drive my kids to school every day, if they're on time, and then we can catch the 8 o'clock news. I listen on Galut. We listen to the Hebrew news in the car, and my favorite thing is on Friday is to hear the non-religious broadcaster telling me what time candlelighting is. Ve'elu zman knisat Shabbat parashat Beshalach. Yerushalayim, Arba Vereva, whatever it is, and Ve'elu Zman, Zmanei Yitziat Shabbat, and it gives you all the times in all the cities, and then it tells you, Shabbat Mevarchim, Shabbat Rosh Chodesh, like whatever, and that's a beautiful thing, by the way. And when you look at it, a lot of people, when they mention dates in Israel, they don't use America, they don't use January, February, they'll use Adar, Nisan, like that, Rosh Chodesh. But here, in the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, what happened? They realized, no, this is not permanent. Therefore, we're going to keep remnants of what we did in Babylonia, and that's why the language stayed. Venira, shezeh, and this is wild. He says, shezeh gam hatam madua nichtav haTalmud haYerushalmi ba'aramis. The Bishlomo habavli shnichta b'Bavel nichta b'Saf haMedina. Aval Yerushalmi shnichta b'Eretz Yisrael modu nichta b'Aramis. Aval dvorenu nasazeh me'at hamanal. He says because if everybody studied Talmud, the regular Talmud, which we normally study, is the Babylonian Talmud in the Daf Yomi, etc. So certainly, since it was the rabbis in Babylonia, and there was a hefty share of Aramaic. But if anyone's ever studied the Jerusalem Talmud, which is far more different than the Babylonian Talmud stylistically, it doesn't flow the same way, doesn't feel the same way. The whole way it's structured is extremely different. But the Aramaic in the Jerusalem Talmud is, in my mind, 10 times more complicated than that of the Babylonian Talmud. And he says, and that's why. He says, even though it was written in Israel, Jerusalem Talmud in Aramaic makes no sense. But that's why, because it was composed during this time, during the second Beis HaMikdash, and they knew that it wouldn't be permanent, so they kept their language. It's unbelievable. They kept their language knowing that they were not going to be there permanently. He says, V'ayin la'el, and he says, and look earlier, B'Parshas Vayechi, where he wrote, he quotes his own, I love when you can quote your own book. And he says, explains why in this period, when we have, of course, the story of Hanukkah, and the Ramban also has a scathing rebuke on the Maccabees, the Chashmonayim. Well, let's put it this way: the pasuk in Vayechi says, "Lo yaser shevet miYehuda," that the kingship has to come from the tribe of Judah. David, King Solomon, they all were from the tribe of Yehuda. The Chashmonayim, what do we know about the Maccabees? They were what? They were Kohanim. Right. They were Kohanim. They were related to you, Gail. Right? They were Kohanim.
Yeah, not me.
I know. You know, the same. You get equal credit. Trust me. You get to eat the truma like everybody else who's married to a Kohen. But they were Kohanim, which means obviously they were not from the tribe of Yehuda. How did they ever get that? Because what happened is that when they had their conquerorship, after the story of Hanukkah and the Hasmonean dynasty took over, they made themselves kings against the rule of law. And the Ramban writes is that was terrible. And that's why the Gemara in Bava Basra says, if anybody comes today and says, I am from the house of Chashmonaim, he's lying because they no longer exist. They ruled themselves into extinction, assimilation. Bad end of the story, which we don't like to talk about on Hanukkah because kind of interferes with the mojo and the celebration of the holiday. But not the brightest ending. He says, so how is it that they could have kings that were not from the house of David? He says, and because having a kingship from David and from the house of Yehuda was for the ultimate redemption. He says, and even though it was completely prohibited, they didn't make such a big deal out of it because you know what? This is not going to last anyway. You can make yourselves kings, but this is not the real kings of Israel because this redemption is not going to last. And he says, he says, now we could see something really something wonderful or an amazement in the order of the Nevi'im. Shaharei Nevuas Chagai, Hamisyachesses Beruva Albinyan. You could, by the way, if you have time to read through these notes, if I read through the notes, really interesting. By Shani. Okay, there's my text curving off. He says that the Nevuah of Chagai, which is mostly about the building of the second Beis HaMikdash, Nemra la'achar Nevuas Yecheskel, was told after the prophecy of Ezekiel, who spoke about the third Beis HaMikdash. Now, there are references to the third Beis HaMikdash in the prophet in Yecheskel. The Gemara discusses it. Rashi, there's a famous opinion of Rashi that the third Beis HaMikdash is just kind of magically dropped down from heaven. Now, there are a lot of people who have made models and are trying to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. Of course, if you would go to and I've had this on a conversation with a lot of different people in different circles, but in the Dati Le'umi circles, in the modern religious, however you want to characterize them, but what's known as Dati Le'umi in Israel, that in those yeshivas and in those circles, the number one topic that's debated is Har HaBayit. Can you go up to Har HaBayit or not? And there are lots of different opinions about that. And it's actually gotten much easier in the last few years for Jews to go on Har HaBayit. You're going to ask me, so I'll just tell you personally, I won't go to Har HaBayit. I don't. My understanding of the halacha of how it works is that I that's me. But I know many people, many people who would go, which is fine, right? So whatever floats your boat. That's just me personally. I won't go. People that are very close to me that I know, I go there all the time, So my daughter in seminary now, she said that one of the teachers, that she has this thing where she takes a bride on her day of her wedding, she'll take them to Har HaBayit for a special tefillah, which I think is a beautiful thing. It's just, nish famir. Okay. Anyway, so he says, so if Yechezkel was talking about the third Beis HaMikdash, the Adarabba, Iker shlichus shel Chagai haisel litzavos l'Rosh Yehuda lo litzapos lamtin l'achras hayomim el livnos beintai mikdashen. He says, and if Yechezkel is talking about the third Beis HaMikdash, and Chagai was talking about, listen, all you the tribes of Yehuda, don't wait for the end of days. Don't wait for that. Build the second Beis HaMikdash now, at least to tide you over, so to speak. Avot zet tzarich bir, he says, this requires explanation. Madua nitztava Yechezkel al habayis hashlishi, kodem shenitztava Chagai al bayis hasheni, le'ezet tzarich ekdimu al esam ucher. He said, if Yechezkel came first, if Ezekiel is giving prophecy about the third Beis HaMikdash, why would that be before Chagai has to give about the second Beis HaMikdash? Why would it be out of order like that? He says, Amnam lafi masha kasafti shaper nicha. That stands for lafi masha kasafti. He says, nevertheless, according to what I've just written, he says it works out beautifully. The nevuas Yechezkel odos habayis hashlishi behecher charitz tzricha lios mukdemes. He says, no, there had to be the third Beis HaMikdash prophecy coming first. Because that's what give the Jewish people the ultimate redemption, the permanent redemption, the complete redemption. However you want to phrase that, Geulah Shalema usually is complete, but in other words, that's the redemption. He says, and when are we waiting for? When we say we're waiting for the Geulah Shalema, even in the first Beis HaMikdash, they were waiting for that, which in actuality is the third Beis HaMikdash. Nobody saw the second Beis HaMikdash as Geulah Shalema, as the complete redemption. The Geulah Hasida, Masha'en Ken Chagai, but in the case of Chagai, Nitztaveh al Bayesheni Shahaya Aroi, Ubabazman Galas Chalkit, L'cheni Vaso Baba Charona, V'dok Hetev B'chol Zeh. And he said, but Chagai was there as a temporary sort of stopgap measure. The people had to come back. They needed something because they would never make it to the Geulah Shalema if they didn't have this in the meantime. So it just shows you, by the way, when we talk about redemption, and this is why it's mentioned here in the Chumash, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, had they waited one more minute, had the Malachi Asher is not advised HaKadosh Baruch Hu, however you want to look at it, it's based on a Zohar. The Jewish people sank to the lowest level of the 50 levels of Tumah. They wouldn't have been able to be redeemed. Sometimes redemption has to be hastened because if we don't go now, we'll never get out. And I'm sure that we can identify with this. Certainly, if you had families that left and were successful in getting out of Eastern Europe at a certain time, and they would say, if we would waited another day, another week, another month, we'd be dead. We could, that notion resonates with us, and we feel so fortunate. Those people, when you almost have this like survivor guilt. Oh, my family got out in 1935. They had an inkling, they had an uncle, they had a visa, they went to Palestine, they went here, whatever it is. But they're alive to talk about it, okay? But here, and Mass saying that God brought this about because they didn't have any other choice. So let's see what he finishes up. So now he comes to our parsha, which we say every day in the Shira. Ad Yavor Amcha Hashem, Ad Yavor Amzu Kanisa. The Gemara says, Ad Yavor Amcha Hashem, Zubiya Rishona, Ad Yavor Amzu Kanisa, Zubiya Shaniya. Ela Shagaram Hachet. He says one refers to the first coming and the second coming. He says, what does that mean? Emes, we only needed two redemptions. Hainu, Binyan Bayis Risha B'mei Shlomo, the first Beis HaMikdash in the time of Shlomo Melech, Ubinyan Bayis Shlish B'mei HaMashiach, and the third one, which comes in the time of Mashiach. Aval, Goram Hachet, the Gemara says, sin got in the way. Shenis Arvavu, V'nisbalalu Ben Hagoyim, But God, in his infinite kindness and really Rahmanas, had to take us out. And Hashem had to take us out because if he didn't take us out, there would be no Jews left to redeem. It's quite a like a heavy piece from Rabbi Yaakov. But in these parshios, when we talk about redemption, what does redemption mean? What does that mean to be free? So for instance, the Gemara in Megillah, when it discusses after the story of Purim, why is it that we don't say Hallel on Purim? And the Gemara says, there's a few answers. One, because it didn't happen in Israel, or another answer to the Gemara is that actually when we say the Megillah, it is a form of Hallel. But the third answer that the Gemara gives, it says, Akate Avde Achashverosh Anan. We're not free. That in other words, even after the story of Purim, they weren't free. They didn't go to Israel. Eventually, the story led to events that got them to go back to the land of Israel because Esther had a son and Darius and and he allowed them to resume the permission they had gotten originally. Okay, but after the story of Purim, Akate Avdei Achashverosh, we were still the slaves of Achashverosh. They were still subjugated to Achashverosh and not freely to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So, and this you can understand then why that there is an opinion that even though so we're definitely seeing something. In other words, if you look at the events of what led up to 1945 and then 1948 so soon after, and everything that's happened since, there's no question that it's something. Now, what you want to call that something, how you want to see that something, I have more of a I wouldn't say apocalyptic, but I would say you can't ignore the incredible ability that we've had, that we right now are at the point where there are more Jews in the land of Israel. They just released the population in Israel, 9.5 million, whatever it is. So just think of how many of those are Jews. There are more Jews in Israel than the rest of the world combined. That paradigm shift is a big deal, especially in halacha, when we talk about certain mitzvahs can only be done if rov yoshveh aleha. So there's something definitely, I'll make up a word, it's geuladik. It's redemption-ish. It's definitely something we talk about Shivas Tzion. We talk about the return to Zion. There's no question, and everybody here. I don't know if there's an exception here. Everybody doesn't have somebody living in their very close family. You don't have to go too many steps away to find a relative living in Israel now, right? Living, studying, wanting to go, whatever it is. Everybody has that, and thank God. So I love it when sometimes parents come to me. Oh, I need to talk to you about my children. Oh, what is it? They want to move to Israel. Oh, First of all, you sent him to a mono-Orthodox school for 12 years. What do you think is going to happen? Baruch, like that should be a problem. No, by the way, I'm not downplaying it. It's very hard for a family. You all know, I have a sister who lives in Israel, and when we have big life cycle events or moments of things, there's definitely that separation is felt. And it's very, very challenging. And especially the last 2 years, it's been unbelievably challenging for people. But that aside, there's no question that, we have to kind of look at where we are. This is not Geulah Shlema, Northeastern New Jersey. As wonderful of a life that we have here, and what we're able to accomplish and what we're able to do, what we're able to even do for the state of Israel, that's not Geulah Shlema. That is not. And if history has taught us anything, we have to kind of understand that. So whatever temples that we build here, we're not doing them completely to the nines because we recognize that this is not our permanent home. It may be permanent for us in our lifetime. Maybe we won't see something more, but for the next generations, et cetera, et cetera. So therefore, it's very important when we read these parshios of Yetzias Mitzrayim, the notion of Geulah and Galus, the notion of redemption and exile have to be put in the proper categorization. They have to be put in the proper perspective, historically, and also looking to the future. So and that's what we always daven for, Geulah Shalema. We daven for the complete and ultimate redemption. We should be zocha to see that in our time. But if you ever wonder, you're sitting at the Shabbos table and somebody says, why is the Jerusalem Talmud in Aramaic? Funny you should mention that. If I recall, I think Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky in Parshas Bo, or also an introduction to Pirkei Avos, has this question, but it also explains why some of the names that you have. So if you look through the Talmud, So many of the names are not necessarily sort of Hebrew names. And the Antigonus Ish Socho. Right, Antigonus is not necessarily the most Jewish name in the world, which is why when we have Jewish kids that, let's say, have some of the names of some of the Gospels, the Apostles, whatever, right? It's like you scratch your head, but you're like, okay, that's America, right? In America, we're not quite Christopher yet, but but there probably are one or two running around, with those types of names. But we shy away from that. But the understanding that you definitely absorb a lot of the culture and where you live, and we take up many of the customs. So I'll just give you another example of this. So if you've ever been to a Persian funeral. Okay, there's Sephardim and there's different types of Sephardim, and then there's Persians. Like everybody has their own sort of mahalach, their own way of doing things. So one of the things that you'll notice at a Persian funeral, and many of them, or if you go to the cemetery, is they'll put tons of flowers on the grave. Which by us, if you're from Eastern European descent and you flower in a grave, it's like the most goyish thing in the world, right? But in actuality, in Persia, in Iran, right, this was common practice. So a lot of that becomes adopted and then transfers over and becomes part of their following and their custom, right? If you the things that we, my friend's mother just passed away about 5 weeks ago, and I was watching the funeral live in Netanya. And it's fascinating because some of the things that we're so careful about, in Israel, like, not a big deal. And I'm talking about halachic things, but again, a lot of it has to do with these sort of cultural norms that they have. And you're talking about like a very religious funeral, and the stuff like they say Kaddish beforehand. They didn't say the burial Kaddish. They whatever. In America, okay, in America, this is like when I have to do my 1 minute like stand up bit about American Judaism, you could eat chazer treif on Yom Kippur while driving home in your car. But don't you dare hand the shovel to somebody in the cemetery. That's like the worst avera you could do in the world. Is handing some, and it's amazing. It's a funny thing. Like everybody who didn't care about anything, that, no, you can't do that. Put it down. Oh my God. Maybe it's a fear of death. Maybe I don't know what it is. Brings it out. But it's funny. Like when you put these things in perspective, some of these cultural norms have become, or when you go, and I mentioned this when I did the yard site here for my father, that if I've been to a zillion funerals like this, that when the mourners start saying Kaddish, everybody starts saying it. They're not mourners. They just like, oh yeah, I know that one. Like, like they feel like, oh, that's what we're supposed to do. So there's Galut and there's Geulah. Really, really important piece. If you have time, if you look through the some of the footnotes, really, really interesting here. Happy to answer any questions about that. But anyway, everybody should stay warm today. Even in your 67 degrees nebuch on you, we're going to knit you a sweater this year. We're going to get together. We're going to have a GoFundMe for a sweater fund for you down in Florida. Nebuch. You better hurry. It's almost dinner time. But enjoy. We'll see everybody next time. God willing. Have a great day.
Thank you,
Bye.
Emma.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.